Let's start with one particular setting. And I know this is the task here is control panel settings, but the one I want to show you actually is here under environment, because it's environment variables that sometimes are one of the more challenging aspects of writing your logon scripts. If you think about it, there are some applications out there that have need for environment variables to be set on machines. Those environment variables could be set on the computer itself. So back up here under Windows settings, environment here under computer configuration, or they could be entered in for a specific user. So down here under the user configuration. If you needed, however, to create an environment variable that corresponded with some application or some other need, it's much easier to configure that as a GPP. So let's create a new environment variable here, a system variable as opposed to a user variable. And we'll configure it here under computer configuration because we will apply this group policy object to an organizational unit full of computers. Let's choose this system variable here where the name, I don't know, var1 would be the value 123. I don't know. Most often you end up using paths as opposed to names here when you're configuring these variables. Java has for a long time required variables if you're using different Java commandlets. Some of the older tools also have need for environment variables. So what we are effectively doing here is configuring this system variable onto a machine. Now, when we configure that system variable, we have 4 different ways in which we can get that variable onto the machine or ripped out of the machine. Recall back on that last clip that I told you a preference is very much unlike a managed group policy setting in that a preference is always permanent. Whenever you create a preference, in order to get rid of it, you actually have to create the inverse GPP to rip it out of any systems where it may have been applied. And so for that reason, up here you have these 4 different actions you can configure for a group policy preference. And each of these is individual to the item that we're dealing with. This only relates to the environment variable item we're creating. And if we create a different preference in the same GPO, we can use different actions as well. Now, these 4 here have very specific meanings. So let me bring up here a little screen that I can show you what the 4 are to give me an opportunity here also to just kind of explain why we have 4 different options here for configuring these preferences. So for the very first item here, we have what is to create the preference. Now, in the case of create, if the setting doesn't exist for this user, then go ahead and create that setting. So if the setting, in this case the environment variable that you're attempting to create, does not exist, then go ahead and create it. But if there already is a setting there, if there happens to be an environment variable with the same name on that machine, then don't do anything at all. So there's a very important difference here because you'll see why as I get to the last of these 4. This is different also from replace, which says remove whatever setting exists and create a new setting. If there isn't a setting there, go ahead and create it. Okay, so the first one was if it's already there, don't do anything. The second one here with replace is replace it if it already exists. The third of which is delete. Delete comes in handy if you need to rip out anything you've done before. So if the setting exists, it will be removed. And then the final of these is update, which in most situations is the action that you will choose most of the time. In the case of update, if the setting exists, it will be updated. And if it does not exist, you'll go ahead and create it. So in most circumstances, what you need is that setting on the machine. If the setting happens to exist, we'll go ahead and update it to whatever we're configuring here in the group policy object. So update in most circumstances is in fact the action that you choose 95% of the time. But this gives us at least a view of what these 4 different options are. Let's choose update here as the setting that we want to choose. Now remember, in every case, we're talking about individual items here. So this environment variable becomes an item that we can then reconfigure or provide more configuration over here under the Common tab. These also become really important as you go about configuring how you want that user's experience to exist or even persist over time. The top one up here says, stop processing the items in this extension if an error occurs. So if for some reason something occurs where there's a wacky error, go ahead and stop processing the items in this extension, so environment variables in this case. If you're actually configuring this over on the user configuration side, the second item down here says to run this preference item using the user's security context. Now this means that instead of using an administrative account in order to accomplish the task, you would use that user's account to do whatever it is you're attempting to accomplish. This can be useful in certain circumstances when whatever you're doing needs to be executed as the user. So maybe you're creating files and folders and you need those files and folders to be copied in as the user. This is a situation when you might want to use the user policy option here. In most circumstances, you just want to run this as the administrator because in most situations, it's unimportant as to which user actually configured this versus who didn't. The third one here is exceptionally important. And you'll notice that this is actually a similar setting to what we saw back in group policy software installation, where back there I told you be careful and you might not ever want to check the box. It is here where you could choose to remove the item when it is no longer applied. Now, just a second ago, I told you that group policy preferences are permanent. And the only way to get rid of them is to create an inverse group policy preference to rip out that setting once applied. There is also the alternative option here to check this box and remove that item, remove this environment variable, should you end up removing this GPO or moving the computer or user out of the OU where it's applied. So this provides you a second opportunity for really removing any of the settings that you're creating here. Be very careful with this checkbox because anytime you move those computers out of that OU, you're going to end up having all the things you've configured perhaps become unconfigured when you check this box. Then the last one down here is to apply once and do not reapply. This checkbox is what makes group policy preferences preferences. When you check this box, this is what configures this to actually be a preference that you set, but then allow the user to reconfigure it if they don't really prefer that setting to be on their machine. In some cases, you can see this as being the case. For example, maybe you're making a registry change that's associated with configuring some aspect of Adobe Reader. Well, maybe you want to get rid of, I don't know, the Adobe Reader splash screen by adjusting the splash screen registry value from a 1 to a 0. Well, maybe the user, I don't know, wants the splash screen. So choosing this to apply once and do not reapply ensures that that user, if they should make the change, will still maintain that change on their machine. Conversely, if you don't want the user to be able to reconfigure things, if you want that group policy refresh to come through and reapply the setting, well then unselect this box here to apply that at every single refresh of group policy. So this gives you the abilities again to make some configurations here for this environment variable. We'll talk more about item level targeting here in a clip coming up.